Daniel Foster had spent years raising the daughter he'd rescued as an infant from the side of a rain-soaked road, and though life had never been easy for him, he held tightly to the belief that decency mattered more than any paycheck. Working the sales floor of a high-end jewelry boutique owned by Sterling & Co., Daniel one day watched his colleagues mock and try to remove an elderly woman from the store simply because she looked poor, and when he was the only person willing to defend her, he was fired on the spot, never suspecting that the woman he had just protected was the mother of the company's powerful young CEO. Could a single act of compassion rewrite his entire future? Stick with this story, because the turn ahead is one you won't expect. Daniel, 40 years old with broad shoulders and eyes that had seen more hardship than most, had never let the world's harshness change who he was. A decade earlier, on a night when rain fell so violently the roads resembled streams, he'd been walking home from a late shift when a faint, frightened cry stopped him cold, coming from a cardboard box tucked beneath the awning of a shuttered pharmacy. Wrapped in a soaked blanket, lay a newborn girl nobody had come to claim. He rushed her to the hospital and spent months afterward searching for her family, filing reports, waiting on phone calls that never came, but no one ever appeared. When the adoption was finalized, Daniel signed the papers with trembling hands, not from fear, but from a quiet certainty that this child belonged with him. He named her Lily, and from then on, every choice he made revolved around what was best for her. To keep them housed and fed, Daniel worked the floor at a boutique under the Sterling & Co. banner, one of the city's most respected jewelry names. The job didn't pay much for the hours it required, but it was dependable, and dependability was everything to a father raising a child alone. He arrived early most mornings to straighten displays and greet regular customers by name, never once complaining, because oversleeping and losing the position wasn't a gamble he could take. His manager, Kevin Wallace, had never respected that dedication. From day one, Kevin treated Daniel with a barely concealed resentment that no one could quite explain, though the rest of the staff seemed to sense its source anyway. Daniel was courteous where Kevin was blunt, patient where Kevin was cold, and customers noticed the contrast, which embarrassed Kevin more than he'd admit. So he found smaller ways to punish him, slashing his hours whenever he requested time off for Lily's school events, ridiculing him in front of co-workers for putting his daughter ahead of what Kevin called real dedication to the job. Daniel rarely reacted. He'd built his entire life on the idea that kindness cost nothing and meant everything, and he wasn't going to abandon that principle to please a manager who measured people by their sales numbers. Besides, he had bigger concerns. Lily was growing quickly, asking tougher questions, needing new shoes every few months, and Daniel intended to give her whatever stability he could, even if that meant biting his tongue at work more often than he wanted to. What none of the staff realized was that the owner of Sterling & Co. had a habit of quietly testing her own stores from within. Alexandra Whitfield, the CEO, was only in her mid-30s but had already earned a reputation as one of the sharpest, most exacting executives in the industry. She rarely appeared at retail locations herself, but her mother, Margaret Whitfield, did something far more revealing. Every few months, Margaret dressed in plain, worn clothing and walked into one of the company's stores like any other shopper, quietly observing how employees treated people who didn't appear wealthy. On an unremarkable afternoon, Margaret wandered into the very boutique where Daniel worked, wearing a faded coat, scuffed shoes, and carrying a handbag that had clearly seen better years. She moved slowly past the display cases, and it wasn't long before Kevin spotted her from across the room. "Can I help you find something?" he asked, though his tone made clear he'd already decided the answer was no. Margaret smiled and asked to view a few pieces near the front counter. Kevin exchanged a knowing glance with two nearby salesmen, one of whom snickered and muttered something about wasted time. Kevin leaned in closer to her, his voice turning sharper. "This section really isn't for browsing," he said. "You might want to try somewhere that fits your budget better." The comment landed exactly as he intended, and though Margaret's expression flickered with hurt, she didn't argue. She simply stepped back, hands folded, carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to humiliation who had learned not to let it show. That stillness was what caught Daniel's attention from across the store. He crossed the floor almost without deciding to, pulled a chair from beside the counter, and set it down gently next to her. "Please, sit," he said. "Let me bring you some water." Margaret looked at him with surprise and gratitude, and for a moment neither spoke. When Daniel returned with the water, he knelt slightly so he was level with her rather than looming the way Kevin had, and began showing her a few modest, elegant pieces rather than the flashy showpieces meant to dazzle. He listened as she spoke, asked what occasion she had in mind, and treated her exactly as he treated every customer, regardless of appearance. Eventually Margaret reached for a simple bracelet, admiring it before her face shifted into something quieter, almost ashamed. "I'm afraid I don't have any money with me today," she confessed. "I only wanted to look." Without hesitation, Daniel pulled out what little cash remained in his wallet for the week and pressed it into her palm. "For a cab home," he said. Nothing more, no strings attached. It was such a small act in the context of the store's daily business, yet it was enough to catch Kevin's eye from across the room. He stormed over, face flushed, demanding to know why Daniel was handing money to a stranger during work hours. Daniel tried to explain, but Kevin wasn't interested in listening. "You're finished," Kevin announced, loudly enough for the whole floor to hear. "Grab your things and leave." The word stung more than Kevin probably intended, but Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded, retrieved his jacket, and walked out into the daylight without looking back, already worrying about how he'd explain this to Lily that night. Margaret watched the whole scene unfold from her seat, and when the cab Daniel had paid for arrived, she didn't go straight home. Instead she asked the driver to take her to her daughter's office, still clutching the folded bills as though they were precious. Alexandra was in the middle of a budget review when her assistant told her that her mother was downstairs, insisting on seeing her right away. She met Margaret in a private lounge on the top floor, and it didn't take long for Margaret to recount everything: Kevin's tone, the exact sum of money Daniel had handed her without being asked. "Pull the security footage," Alexandra told her assistant, her voice flat in the way it became whenever she was truly angry. The footage confirmed every detail. Alexandra watched in silence as Kevin humiliated her mother in front of customers, watched Daniel cross the floor to help her, watched him kneel and speak to her as though she mattered more than anyone else in the building, watched him get fired for it and walk away without protest, without demanding anything in return. She sat back, jaw tight, and turned to her assistant. "Find him," she said. "Tonight, if possible." That evening, Daniel sat at his small kitchen table staring at a pile of overdue bills he'd been avoiding for weeks. Lily sat across from him finishing homework, occasionally glancing up to study his expression the way children do when they sense something is wrong even without being told. "Everything okay, Dad?" she finally asked. Daniel forced a smile and assured her he'd figure things out like always. He was still replaying the day when a knock came at the door. He assumed it was a neighbor or the landlord chasing rent, and was entirely unprepared to find a woman on his doorstep introducing herself as an assistant to Alexandra Whitfield, CEO of Sterling & Company. Daniel's first instinct was to shut the door. He'd heard enough corporate names to know nothing good usually followed them, and the last thing he wanted was some public apology tour after being humiliated and fired in front of co-workers. He politely but firmly declined. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Daniel sat alone turning the offer over in his mind. He thought about his pride, about all the times he'd refused help because accepting it felt like admitting defeat. He thought about the double shifts, the months he'd gone without new clothes so Lily could have hers, the constant quiet fear underlying every financial decision. Pride had carried him this far, but it wouldn't fund Lily's future. The assistant returned the next morning with a clarification that changed everything. This wasn't charity, she explained. Alexandra was offering him a genuine position within the company, a chance to build something instead of scraping by under managers like Kevin. Daniel listened, and for the first time since her visit, he seriously considered it. He glanced at Lily quietly eating breakfast at the counter, unaware that both their lives were about to change course. He thought about her future, her schooling, the kind of life he wanted for her, one that didn't hinge entirely on surviving one more bad shift behind a retail counter. "Tell Miss Whitfield I'll come in," Daniel finally said. It wasn't surrender, and it wasn't charity accepted out of desperation, it was a decision made the same way he made every important choice, with his daughter's future at its center. Daniel's first week at Sterling & Co.'s headquarters felt like stepping into someone else's life entirely. The building stood 30 stories tall, all glass and silent elevators, and everyone who passed him in the hallways moved with a confidence he'd never needed in his old job. Alexandra met with him personally on his second day, and rather than offering him a check or gift as he'd feared, she laid out the real terms of an executive assistant position, complete with a salary that made him sit back in his chair before he could respond. Even when she mentioned a car and bonus as a personal thank you for what he'd done for her mother, Daniel shook his head, explaining that he hadn't helped Margaret expecting anything in return, and accepting extra gifts now would cheapen what had happened. He said all he wanted was work that would let him look Lily in the eye someday and know he'd earned everything he gave her. Alexandra studied him for a long moment afterward, the way someone studies a person unlike anyone they've met before. Margaret, for her part, took an immediate liking to Daniel that only deepened over time. She began stopping by his desk on small pretexts, bringing leftover pastries from events, lingering to ask about Lily's day at school. Daniel found himself looking forward to those visits more than he expected, without letting himself dwell on why. Not everyone in the building shared Margaret's warmth. Nathaniel Cole, a senior executive, had spent years positioning himself as Alexandra's natural partner, both professionally and eventually romantically, believing a union between them would finally grant him the control over Sterling & Co. he'd wanted since joining the company. At first, Nathaniel barely registered Daniel as a threat, dismissing him as a temporary hire brought on out of gratitude who would fade once the novelty wore off. That assumption didn't last. Daniel proved sharper than people judging him by his background expected. He caught scheduling conflicts before they escalated, remembered details about clients and staff others forgot, and treated everyone in the building, from executives to cleaning staff, with the same steady respect he'd once shown Margaret in the store. Alexandra began asking his opinion in meetings unrelated to his official duties, and more than once changed a decision after hearing his perspective. It was a subtle shift at first, barely noticeable, but exactly the kind people like Nathaniel were trained to catch immediately. The turning point came during a quarterly strategy meeting when Alexandra overruled a proposal Nathaniel had spent weeks preparing, choosing instead an alternative Daniel had mentioned to her in passing the day before. Nathaniel sat through the rest of the meeting composed, but once it ended, he watched Alexandra and Daniel continue talking by the window long after everyone else had left, their conversation easy in a way that had nothing to do with business. It wasn't jealousy alone gripping him. 2 board members had recently begun raising questions about succession planning, wondering aloud whether the company needed fresh leadership from outside its usual executive circle, and Daniel's name had come up more than once. Nathaniel understood immediately what was at stake. If Alexandra's feelings for Daniel deepened, and if the board began viewing him as more than just her assistant, both the marriage Nathaniel had quietly engineered for years and the influence he'd built within the company could collapse together. He needed an ally who already resented Daniel, and didn't have to search far. Kevin Wallace had been sitting at home for weeks since his outburst at the store, technically still employed but stripped of real responsibility after corporate reviewed his conduct toward Margaret. Kevin blamed Daniel entirely, convinced that if Daniel had simply let the old woman leave quietly, none of this would have happened to him. When Nathaniel offered privately to get him reinstated as a regional manager in exchange for help handling what he called the Daniel problem, Kevin didn't hesitate. Their first move required little risk. Nathaniel began feeding suggestions to reporters he trusted, framing Daniel as a man who had used his own adopted daughter as leverage to work his way into Alexandra's life, twisting the rescue of Margaret into something calculated rather than kind. Within days, the story spread through the company and into headlines questioning whether the CEO's new executive assistant had orchestrated the entire jewelry store incident from the start. Daniel read the first article at his desk one morning, his stomach tightening as he scrolled through comments from strangers who knew nothing about him or Lily yet felt entitled to judge them both. He considered pretending he hadn't seen it, but Alexandra had already read it herself. She called a company-wide meeting that same afternoon, gathering staff from every department into the largest conference room in the building. Daniel stood near the back, unsure if he belonged there, watching Alexandra take her place at the front with the same composed authority she brought to every negotiation. "I want to address these rumors directly," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "This man helped my mother when everyone around her chose to humiliate her instead. He asked for nothing in return, not money, not a title, nothing. I won't let this company turn kindness into scandal just because it makes an easier headline." The room fell into uneasy silence, every eye shifting toward Daniel. Some employees nodded, relieved their CEO had defended him so directly, while others exchanged glances revealing the rumors had already done damage. By day's end, the staff had split into two camps, those who trusted Alexandra's judgment without question, and those who whispered about favoritism, wondering how far she'd go to protect a man she'd known only weeks. For Daniel, hearing her defend him so openly stirred something unexpected. He was used to being invisible in rooms like that, used to being dismissed the way Kevin had dismissed Margaret. Watching Alexandra stake her own credibility on his character left him with a feeling he couldn't quite name, warmer than gratitude and more complicated than simple respect. Alexandra felt it too, though far more guarded about acknowledging it even to herself. She'd spent years building walls around her personal life, having learned early that vulnerability in her position often became a weapon in someone else's hands. Yet she found herself thinking of Daniel at odd hours, replaying small moments from their conversations, noticing how he spoke of Lily with a tenderness that had nothing to do with performance. It unsettled her, though not in a way she wanted to escape. The public defense didn't end the story as Alexandra hoped. Photographers began waiting outside Daniel's apartment building hoping to catch a photo of the man at the center of the controversy, and one afternoon a reporter followed Lily nearly to her school before a neighbor intervened. When Margaret heard, she insisted, over Daniel's objections, that he and Lily move into the family estate temporarily, somewhere with gates and security that could actually protect a 10-year-old from strangers with cameras. Daniel resisted at first, unwilling to let someone else's money rearrange his life, but the sight of Lily flinching at a slowing car near their building settled the matter. At the estate, Lily began forming her own bond with Alexandra, unaware of the tension building around her father at the office. Alexandra made a point of joining them for dinner most evenings, first out of a sense of responsibility for uprooting their lives, then simply because she wanted to. Lily would tell her about school assignments, friends, a science project for the upcoming fair, and Alexandra found herself listening with genuine interest that surprised even her. There was something steadying about Lily's easy trust, something that reminded her of the family life she'd rarely experienced growing up amid boardrooms and business dinners. None of that warmth reached Nathaniel, who watched the growing closeness between Daniel's family and Alexandra with mounting urgency. The rumors alone hadn't removed Daniel from the picture, and Alexandra's public defense had only strengthened his position. Understanding that subtler tactics had failed, Nathaniel turned toward something more direct, something that wouldn't just damage Daniel's reputation but eliminate him from the company entirely. He met with Kevin again privately one evening after most staff had gone home. The plan was reckless, but Nathaniel had access to security clearances tied to the company's most valuable inventory, including diamond pieces recently acquired for an upcoming showcase collection. If those pieces disappeared and evidence pointed to Daniel, no amount of goodwill from Alexandra would save him. Kevin hesitated only briefly before agreeing, still bitter enough to convince himself Daniel deserved whatever followed. Nathaniel assured him the plan would be quiet and untraceable, carried out during a maintenance window when most building security would be offline for scheduled updates. Neither man realized one narrow corridor near the lower level, unrelated to the main system, still had an older camera running independently, a detail neither thought to check. As the two finalized their plan, Daniel was at the estate helping Lily glue together the final pieces of her science project, unaware the ground beneath his new life was about to shift again. He'd begun cautiously believing things might finally settle into something stable and good. Alexandra's declaration in front of the company had given him a confidence he hadn't felt in years, a sense that maybe this new chapter wouldn't collapse the way so many before it had. He didn't yet know how quickly that confidence would be tested, or how far Nathaniel and Kevin were willing to go. The maintenance window arrived on a Thursday night exactly as planned, most building security systems went dark for scheduled updates, and the halls emptied before midnight except for a skeleton crew of janitorial staff on the lower floors. Nathaniel used his clearance to slip into the vault level, Kevin following with a duffel bag tucked under one arm, both moving with the careful silence of men who'd rehearsed every step. Inside the vault, diamond pieces meant for the showcase collection sat in a locked case worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Nathaniel disabled the secondary lock using credentials he was never meant to share, and within minutes the pieces were gone, wrapped and hidden in Kevin's duffel bag as he slipped out through a service exit. Neither noticed the small camera mounted above the corridor outside the vault, an older unit installed years earlier for a maintenance contractor and somehow overlooked during the system-wide shutdown. The next morning, Nathaniel made an anonymous call to building security claiming he'd noticed something unusual near Daniel's office the previous night. When investigators searched it, they found exactly what had been planted, a velvet pouch tucked behind a filing cabinet containing 2 of the missing diamond pieces. Daniel was called into a private meeting before he'd even removed his jacket that morning, and within the hour found himself facing company lawyers instead of Alexandra. He tried explaining he'd never known the pieces existed, had no access to the vault level, and that someone must have planted the evidence, but the lawyers, though polite, gave more weight to the physical evidence on the table than his words. By early afternoon, news outlets already had the story, one headline running across a local broadcast that turned his stomach: single father arrested after betraying CEO's trust. It painted him as a man who'd exploited a wealthy family's generosity and stolen from the very company that gave him a second chance. Alexandra faced pressure from every direction at once. The board demanded an immediate public response, several members insisting that keeping Daniel employed even during an investigation would damage the company's reputation irreparably. Reporters camped outside headquarters, and calls poured in from major clients questioning whether the company's leadership could manage its own security. Alexandra wanted to believe Daniel completely, and part of her did, but the evidence was specific enough to shake even her certainty. Margaret was the only family member who never wavered. She sat with Alexandra one evening, reminding her of the man who'd knelt to speak with an old woman nobody else in that store had bothered to look at twice, insisting that a man capable of that kind of quiet decency didn't suddenly become a thief the moment he was handed real opportunity, urging her daughter to keep searching for the truth instead of accepting the easiest explanation. At the estate, the fallout reached Lily faster than Daniel wanted. Classmates who'd seen the news online began repeating the accusations at school, some outright calling her father a criminal, others simply avoiding her the way children avoid anything uncomfortable. Lily came home one afternoon with red eyes she tried to hide, insisting nothing was wrong until Daniel gently pressed her enough that the truth spilled out. That night, he sat alone in the dark long after she'd gone to bed, replaying every decision that had led him here, wondering if accepting Alexandra's offer had been a mistake. He heard soft footsteps and turned to find Lily standing in the doorway, unable to sleep, silhouetted by hallway light. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him without a word, holding on the way she used to when she was younger and afraid of storms. "I don't care what anyone says," she finally told him. "You're the best person I know, Dad. That's never going to change." Her words didn't erase the fear in his chest, but gave him enough strength to keep going. Watching his daughter suffer because of accusations against him was more than Daniel could bear silently. He decided staying at the estate any longer would only drag Alexandra further into a scandal that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with people trying to destroy him. Before the board could force her hand, he packed a small bag, left a short note explaining he didn't want to cause her more damage, and walked out through the estate gates without telling anyone where he was going, taking Lily to stay with an old coworker across town while he figured out what to do next. Alexandra found the note that evening, and the sight of his steady handwriting broke something loose in her that she'd kept locked away for years. She refused to accept this was how the story ended, and instead of retreating into the safety the board wanted, she threw herself into finding the truth, working late into the night with the company's internal security team, determined to uncover what the surface evidence had conveniently left out. It took nearly a week of careful digging before her security director found the overlooked footage from the corridor outside the vault, the one system that had somehow stayed active during the shutdown. The footage was grainy but unmistakable, showing two figures moving through the vault level well after hours, their mannerisms enough for facial recognition software to confirm identities within minutes. Cross-referencing badge access logs from that night placed Nathaniel and Kevin inside the building at the exact time the footage captured them. Alexandra called an emergency board meeting the next morning, presenting the footage and access records without warning to either man. Nathaniel argued the footage was inconclusive, that anyone could have walked that corridor for innocent reasons, but the timestamps and matching entry logs left no real room for doubt. Security escorted him out within the hour, police waiting by the time he reached the lobby, already contacted based on the evidence Alexandra's team had compiled. Kevin, questioned separately, broke down almost immediately once he realized Nathaniel wouldn't cover for him as promised, confessing to planting the evidence in Daniel's office and explaining in detail how Nathaniel had offered his old position back in exchange for helping frame an innocent man. By day's end, Sterling & Co. issued a public statement clearing Daniel of all wrongdoing, confirming the real culprits had been identified and now faced criminal charges. Daniel was still staying with his old co-worker when Alexandra finally found him, having tracked down the address through Margaret, who had quietly kept in touch with him during his absence. She knocked on the door that evening, and when he opened it, neither spoke for a long moment, the weight of everything settling between them. "I should have trusted my instincts sooner," Alexandra said. "I'm sorry it took this long to prove what I already knew about you." Daniel stepped aside to let her in, and over the next hour they talked more honestly than in any previous conversation, stripped of the careful distance they'd both maintained out of fear of complicating something neither fully understood yet. Alexandra admitted her feelings for him hadn't come from gratitude over what he'd done for her mother, but from everything she'd witnessed since, his patience, his integrity, the quiet strength with which he loved his daughter. Daniel, who'd spent a decade building walls around his heart to focus entirely on Lily, finally allowed himself to acknowledge what he'd been feeling for weeks, admitting he'd been afraid to hope for anything beyond survival for so long that he'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to want something purely for himself. Sitting in that small borrowed apartment, neither rich in that moment beyond what mattered most, Daniel let himself believe for the first time in years that he deserved a future that included more than mere endurance. Margaret welcomed both Daniel and Lily back to the estate, not as guests this time but as family in every sense. She spent afternoons teaching Lily to bake the same recipes she'd once made for Alexandra as a child, and evenings sitting with Daniel on the porch, sharing stories about Sterling & Co.'s early days before it grew into the empire it was now. The bond between them felt less like gratitude repaid and more like something that had always belonged there, simply waiting to be recognized. The wedding took place months later, small and unpretentious despite Alexandra's position, held in the garden behind the estate rather than some grand downtown ballroom. Lily stood beside her father during the ceremony, radiant with the security of finally having a complete family. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, the only sound in the garden was wind rustling through the trees, and as Daniel and Alexandra exchanged vows, Margaret cried openly, unashamed of how deeply this moment had been years in the making. Shortly after, Alexandra formally adopted Lily, completing on paper what had already become true in every other sense, and the three of them became at last one family bound not by circumstance but by choice. Together, Daniel and Alexandra established the Hope Home Foundation, dedicated to supporting abandoned children and the families who choose to adopt them, funding resources Daniel wished had existed during those uncertain months after he first found Lily. Alexandra also used her position to reshape the culture within Sterling & Co., implementing new standards for how every employee, from cashier to executive, was expected to treat every customer who walked through the door, regardless of appearance or wealth. Years later, Daniel and Lily returned to the same street corner where he'd once found her wrapped in a soaked blanket inside a cardboard box. Lily was taller now, confident, thriving in ways that carried no trace of the fear she'd once felt at school. Daniel watched her walk a few steps ahead, laughing about something unrelated to any of this, and found himself smiling at the strange, quiet truth of it all. The same instinct that once led him to rescue an abandoned infant on a rainy night had, years later, led him to defend a stranger nobody else in that store cared to help, and in the end, that single act of kindness, offered without any expectation of return, had given them both a family and a future neither had ever dared imagine. If this story reminded you that kindness never truly goes unnoticed, that's the whole point of telling it. You never know whose life you might change by choosing to be decent to someone the world has already decided to ignore. If you enjoyed this one, follow the channel so you don't miss the next story, and drop a comment letting us know what you would have done in Daniel's place.